In November of 1849, a circuit court judge working in Davidson County, Tennessee, made a startling discovery: for marriage certificates all filed on the same exact day. All 4 documents were signed by the same preacher, and all 4 listed the very same groom. That groom was Solomon Hayes, an enslaved man who belonged to the Beaumont family. The 4 brides were the quadruplet sisters, Evangeline, Arabella, Cordelia, and Josephine Beaumont, who were all born on the same February morning in 1827. These certificates were, from a legal standpoint, impossible. Tennessee law strictly forbade any marriage between white women and enslaved men. The purported ceremony described could not legally have occurred. Despite this, 23 witnesses had endorsed the documents with their signatures, including 3 prominent businessmen from Nashville, a medical doctor, and the mayor of a nearby town. When the judge dispatched deputies to investigate the Beaumont estate, Magnolia Heights, located 12 miles south of Nashville, they found the plantation deserted. The main residence was empty, its doors swung open, and the furniture was obscured by dust. In the subcellar beneath the kitchen, the deputies found a hidden room containing 4 identical beds, 4 wardrobes, 4 writing desks, and 4 leather-bound journals that matched. What these journals contained was immediately classified by court order for over 70 years, deemed too profoundly disturbing for public consumption. Yet, the facts surrounding Solomon Hayes and the Beaumont quadruplets represent one of the state of Tennessee's most horrifying historical episodes. It was a calculated system of subjugation and misuse veiled as an improbable romance. Before we reveal the full, horrifying truth of what transpired at Magnolia Heights, if this narrative is already giving you chills, you need to do one thing right now: hit that subscribe button. This channel is Whispers and Frames, and we explore the most shadowy corners of American history. We dig into the accounts that were buried deep in courthouse basements and locked away in forgotten historical archives. I'm also curious, where are you listening from? Please drop a comment with your state or city. Are you near Davidson County, Tennessee? Does your community hide dark secrets from its past like this one? Let's uncover them together. Now, allow me to take you back to the very beginning. Coldface: A Cold Birth in 1827. We start on a winter morning in 1827, the day 4 identical girls came into the world, born into a family that would structure their entire lives around a single, dreadful objective. That winter brought an unusual freeze to Middle Tennessee. The Cumberland River iced over so completely that wagons could cross on the frozen surface, a natural event no one living could recall ever seeing. At Magnolia Heights Plantation, which was 18 miles south of Nashville, Elizabeth Beaumont went into labor 3 weeks prematurely. The delivery was difficult and extended. Dr. Samuel Pritchard, who had been urgently called from Nashville in the dead of night, arrived to find Elizabeth already far along in labor, attended by 2 midwives and her mother-in-law, the imposing Catherine Beaumont. What should have been a simple, routine birth grew more and more complicated as the hours passed. At dawn on February 14th, the first baby was born, a girl they named Evangeline. The midwives started to clean the newborn and care for Elizabeth, but Dr. Pritchard noticed something unsettling: the labor had not ceased. 15 minutes later, a second girl arrived, who was named Arabella. Then, almost unbelievably, came a third, Cordelia. And finally, 20 minutes after Cordelia, the fourth daughter, Josephine. 4 identical girls born within an hour and a half of each other. All of them healthy, all crying with matching voices, and all bearing the same distinctive mark on their left shoulder, a crescent moon-shaped, wine-colored birthmark. Elizabeth Beaumont survived the childbirth but never truly recovered her health. She spent months confined to her bed, weak and struggling with fever. By the time she finally regained some strength, her daughters were 6 months old, being looked after by enslaved women in the nursery, while Elizabeth often struggled to tell the 4 children apart. Man office worker: the father's problem. The father, Harrison Beaumont, was 42 years old when his daughters were born. He owned 3,000 acres of prime farmland, held 137 people in slavery, and commanded enough political influence that he could dine with the state governor whenever he visited Nashville. Harrison had built his vast fortune through the cultivation of cotton and tobacco, and by marrying strategically into well-established families. His first wife had died in 1823, leaving him without an heir. His marriage to Elizabeth Carrington in 1825 was purely a strategic alliance, joining 2 prominent Middle Tennessee families. He had fully anticipated the birth of a son, an heir who would inherit Magnolia Heights and carry on the Beaumont name. Instead, he received 4 identical daughters, whose very existence seemed to mock his dynastic aspirations. From the moment he received the news of the quadruplets' birth, Harrison began to regard them not as beloved children, but as an obstacle that required a resolution. He consulted medical professionals in Nashville, composing detailed letters describing the unusual birth and asking if such children could be expected to mature normally. He engaged ministers regarding the theological significance of identical multiple births, questioning aloud whether this occurrence was a form of divine punishment or a test. Most disturbing of all, he began corresponding with contacts across the South who shared his keen interest in what he termed hereditary science, the systematic study of how characteristics were passed down from parents to children, and how selective breeding could be used to improve or degrade bloodlines. Girl-isolated subjects. The Beaumont quadruplets were raised in profound isolation at Magnolia Heights. Harrison prevented them from interacting with other children, claiming he was concerned about their delicate health. Their education was handled by private tutors, women Harrison specifically hired for their willingness to adhere to his very particular guidelines for the girls' schooling. The quadruplets were taught reading, writing, mathematics, French, and music. However, they were also subjected to constant scrutiny, measurement, and testing. Harrison meticulously maintained records of their development, tracking their height and weight every month, and documenting the precise time each began to speak, walk, and read. He recorded all of this information in leather-bound journals, which he kept locked in his study, creating what amounted to a comprehensive scientific record of 4 identical lives. By the time the girls reached their 10th birthday in 1837, they had developed distinct personalities despite their identical looks. Evangeline, the eldest by mere minutes, was serious and thoughtful, preferring literature to play. Arabella was more sociable, quick to laugh, and had a musical nature. Cordelia possessed a quiet intensity, observing her surroundings with analytical precision. Josephine, the youngest, showed an artistic flair, constantly sketching or building things with her hands. But Harrison actively discouraged these differences. He was determined that the girls remain as identical as possible, making them wear matching clothes, adhere to identical schedules, and study the same lessons at the same pace. When Arabella exhibited extraordinary musical talent, Harrison prohibited her from practicing the piano more than her sisters. When Evangeline showed advanced reading comprehension, Harrison restricted her access to books until the others caught up. He was conducting an experiment, though the girls could not yet grasp its nature. Chains the estate and Solomon. The enslaved community at Magnolia Heights lived under conditions that were brutal even for the harsh standards of Tennessee in the 1830s. Harrison Beaumont employed 3 overseers, men notorious throughout Davidson County for their cruelty. Punishments were frequent and severe. Families were torn apart when Harrison decided it was financially advantageous. The living quarters were overcrowded, and food and medical care were minimal. Yet, Harrison publicly portrayed himself as an enlightened plantation owner, one who understood the economic value of maintaining healthy workers. He gave talks at agricultural society meetings on efficient plantation management, published articles in farming journals, and welcomed visits from other planters interested in his methods. The truth was that Harrison regarded every person on his property, whether enslaved or free, as simply a data point in his ongoing studies of heredity, breeding, and control. In 1839, Harrison acquired a man named Solomon Hayes at a state auction in Memphis. Solomon was 21 years old, exceptionally tall at 6 feet 3 inches, with a powerful physique and striking features. The bill of sale described him as literate, skilled in both carpentry and blacksmithing, having good teeth, no history of attempting to escape, and being an excellent physical specimen. Harrison paid $3,200 for Solomon, almost double the standard market price for a man his age. He brought Solomon to Magnolia Heights and assigned him work as a carpenter, constructing new buildings on the expanding estate. However, Harrison's interest in Solomon extended far beyond his value as a laborer. Harrison had been searching for a man who precisely met certain criteria: physical strength and health, demonstrable intelligence, no family ties that could complicate future plans, and, most critically, complete isolation from any support network that might enable resistance. Solomon Hayes was a perfect fit. Solomon was born into slavery in Alabama in 1818. His mother died when he was 6. His father was sold away when Solomon was 10. He had been raised by an elderly woman named Ruth, who secretly taught him to read and write, a dangerous gift that could have resulted in death for both of them if discovered. Ruth died when Solomon was 17. By 1839, Solomon had spent most of his life alone, moved from one plantation to another as he was bought and sold, never staying long enough anywhere to form meaningful bonds, and never finding anyone who could become family. Harrison recognized this isolation and planned to exploit it fully. Shushing faced the secret alliance. For the first 2 years after Solomon's arrival at Magnolia Heights, he followed instructions, building barns and fixing structures. He was quiet, proficient, and careful to avoid attracting the attention of the overseers. But he was also observing, learning the plantation's rhythms, and understanding how power operated in this place. He noticed details others missed: the way Harrison would vanish into his study for hours with his journals, the manner in which the quadruplet sisters were kept separate from everyone else, and the pervasive fear that permeated the slave quarters. Solomon realized he had been brought to Magnolia Heights for a purpose beyond carpentry, though he did not yet know what it was. The quadruplets first encountered Solomon in the summer of 1841, when they were 14 years old. Harrison had commissioned the construction of a new building behind the main house, a structure he called a study hall, where the girls would continue their education. Solomon was assigned to build it. The girls watched from their second-floor windows as Solomon worked, fascinated by this tall, silent man who moved with such precision and power. One afternoon, Evangeline dropped a book from her window. It landed close to where Solomon was working. He picked it up, glanced at the title, and then looked up toward the window. Their eyes met for perhaps 3 seconds. Solomon carefully set the book on the window ledge where Evangeline could retrieve it, then returned to his work without saying a word. That brief, silent exchange marked the beginning of something neither of them could have foreseen. Over the ensuing months, small interactions increased. A book left out for Solomon to find. The book returned with a flower marking a specific page. Notes carefully written in the margins, subtly phrased questions about carpentry, about the outside world beyond Magnolia Heights, and about whether Solomon believed freedom was achievable. His responses were written in equally cautious language, always aware that discovery meant immediate death. The correspondence began with Evangeline, but eventually included all 4 sisters. They were desperate for a connection with someone outside of their isolated existence, someone who treated them as genuine individuals rather than scientific specimens. Solomon, equally isolated, found himself drawn into these conversations, which felt both dangerous and fundamentally necessary. Scroll the Monster's Proposal. In December of 1841, Harrison Beaumont summoned Solomon to his study. This was highly unusual. Enslaved laborers were never brought into the main house unless performing a specific task. Solomon entered the study with trepidation, finding Harrison seated behind a massive desk covered with journals and papers. Harrison stared at Solomon for a long moment before finally speaking. "Sit down," Harrison commanded, gesturing to a chair. Solomon complied, maintaining a neutral expression despite his racing thoughts. "I have been observing you for 2 years now," Harrison continued. "Your workmanship is outstanding. Your intelligence is evident. You maintain discipline even when you believe you are unobserved. These are precisely the qualities I hoped to find when I purchased you." Solomon remained silent, waiting. Harrison leaned closer. "I am going to explain something to you that you must never repeat. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, I will have you killed. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Solomon replied quietly. Harrison pulled one of his journals toward him, opening it to a page filled with charts and annotations. "I have 4 daughters," Harrison began. "Quadruplets, identical in every quantifiable respect. Their existence offers a unique opportunity for scientific study. I have been meticulously documenting their development since birth, monitoring how heredity and environment influence identical individuals. But my research must now expand into the next generation." Solomon's stomach seized up as he began to grasp the true direction of this conversation. Harrison continued, his voice utterly clinical and detached. "I need to control the heredity of my daughter's children. I must ensure they marry a person whose genetic qualities I can accurately predict and document. Someone healthy, intelligent, strong, and someone who presents no legal claim to the Beaumont property because he can never inherit. Someone with no family to complicate matters." Harrison looked directly at Solomon. "Someone like you." The plan Harrison then outlined was monstrous in its exactness. When the quadruplets turned 18 in 1845, each would be married to Solomon in separate, private ceremonies conducted by ministers Harrison had already secured through bribery and blackmail. The marriages would be documented but kept strictly secret, filed in church records that would only be discovered by someone who knew precisely where to look. The girls would then bear children by Solomon, all first cousins who were also half-siblings, all documented subjects in Harrison's generational heredity study. The children would be raised at Magnolia Heights under Harrison's continuous observation. The entire program would continue for at least 2, possibly 3 generations, creating what Harrison proudly called a controlled heredity experiment on an unprecedented scale. "And what is my role in this plan?" Solomon asked, his voice carefully devoid of emotion despite the horror surging through him. "You will live better than any enslaved man in Tennessee," Harrison promised. "You will be given a private cabin, good food, and no fieldwork. You will father children who will never be sold. You will be essential to something greater than your individual life. However, you must also understand that any attempt to resist, any attempt to escape, or any attempt to reveal this arrangement to anyone will result not only in your death, but in the deaths of my daughters and any children born to them. I possess connections and resources you cannot imagine. Cross me, and everyone involved simply disappears. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Solomon repeated. "Good. You have 4 years to consider this before the marriages take place. Use that time wisely. New moon a calculated decision. Solomon left the study in a state of controlled shock. He returned to his small cabin in the quarters and sat in darkness for hours, processing every detail of Harrison's proposition. The plan was pure evil in its calculated exploitation of everyone involved. The quadruplets would be forced into an arrangement they likely knew nothing about yet. Their children would be reduced to mere subjects in a study, treating human beings like livestock to be bred and observed. And Solomon would be the instrument of it all, complicit in every birth, every violation, and every generation of suffering. But Solomon was, above all, a survivor. Over 23 years of enslavement, he had learned that direct resistance almost always led only to death. If he refused Harrison, he would be killed. The quadruplets would probably be married off to other men Harrison chose. The heredity study would simply continue with different subjects. His death would achieve absolutely nothing. However, compliance, or the appearance of compliance, might create opportunities. It might allow him to operate from within this nightmare to protect the girls, to sabotage Harrison's dark plans, and eventually to find escape or retribution, or both. That very night, Solomon made his definitive choice. He would agree to Harrison's plan, but he would also begin his own long-term planning. He would survive long enough to discover a way to utterly destroy Harrison Beaumont and everything the man represented. Handshake preparation and resistance. The 4 years between 1841 and 1845 passed slowly at Magnolia Heights. Harrison continued his obsessive documentation of the quadruplets' development. The girls, now aware through their secret correspondence with Solomon that something momentous awaited them, began their own quiet preparations. Evangeline began keeping a journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room, carefully documenting her father's bizarre behaviors and invasive questions. Arabella started asking their tutors carefully worded questions about marriage law, inheritance rights, and what rights women actually possessed in Tennessee. Cordelia studied her father's study from a distance, learning his routines, noting when he locked his journals away, and where he might keep the keys. Josephine, using her artistic skills, began making detailed sketches of the plantation layout, marking every building, every road, and every potential escape route. Solomon, meanwhile, used his position as carpenter to move with relative freedom around the estate. He built relationships with other enslaved people, carefully selecting those he believed he could trust. He learned who held grudges against Harrison, who had lost family members to the man's cruelty, and who might be willing to take risks if the right opportunity presented itself. He also maintained his secret correspondence with the quadruplets, using their exchanges to prepare them for what was coming, assuring them that they were not alone in this horror, and that together, they might find methods to resist. Broken Heart the confrontation. In January of 1845, 1 month before the quadruplets' 18th birthday, Harrison gathered his daughters in his study for the first time. They entered nervously, rarely having been allowed into this private space. Harrison waited until they were all seated, then spoke with the same clinical detachment he had used with Solomon 3 years prior. "You are about to turn 18, Harrison began. At that age, most young women would expect a period of courtship and eventual marriage. Your situation is unique. Because of your singular birth and the scientific value you represent, I have made arrangements that will greatly benefit our family and advance human knowledge." He explained the plan in a highly condensed form, omitting the most horrific details, but making it perfectly clear that all 4 of them would marry the same man, that this man had been selected specifically for his genetic traits, that children were expected, and that everything would be meticulously documented. The girls sat in stunned silence. Finally, Evangeline managed to speak. "You cannot be serious, Father. This is illegal. It is immoral. It is impossible. It is necessary, Harrison replied calmly. And it will happen in 6 weeks. You will cooperate, because the alternative is far worse. I can arrange marriages for you to men who will treat you brutally and separate you from each other forever. Or you can remain together at Magnolia Heights, married to a man who will treat you well, raising children in comfort. The choice should be obvious. What if we refuse? Cordelia asked. Then I will have the man in question killed, and I will proceed with alternative plans that you will find far less appealing. Harrison leaned forward. Make no mistake, this will happen. Your cooperation merely determines how much you suffer in the process. Fire a new resolve. That night, the quadruplets met in secret in Evangeline's room. All four sat together on her bed, speaking in hushed whispers. This is sheer madness, Arabella said, her voice trembling. He wants to breed us like horses, to document our children as if we are some kind of experiment. We are exactly that to him, Cordelia said bitterly. We have always been that. He has been studying us our entire lives. This is simply the next phase. We have to refuse, Josephine said. We have to run away. To where? Evangeline asked. We have no funds, no connections outside of Father's control. If we run, he will find us, and the punishment will be terrible. Not just for us, but for Solomon. Solomon? Arabella repeated quietly. The man Father chose for us. Does he even know about this? He knows, Evangeline confirmed, pulling out the letters she had hidden. He has known for 3 years. He wrote to me about it, not in detail, but enough that I understood something dreadful was planned. The sisters read Solomon's cautious letters, recognizing in his words the same desperate trap they felt. Finally, Cordelia spoke. If we cannot escape, then we must change the terms. We need to make sure that whatever Father plans, it doesn't go the way he expects. How? Josephine asked. By working with Solomon, instead of being passive victims, Cordelia replied. Father views us as experimental subjects, but we are not. We are people who can think, plan, and fight back. If we are forced to go through with these marriages, then we will use them as opportunities. We will gather evidence about Father's activities. We will find allies. We will wait for the perfect moment. Then, we will burn this place to the ground and everyone responsible with it. The venom in Cordelia's voice shocked her sisters. But as they sat together in the darkness, they realized she was correct. Passive resistance would accomplish nothing. If they were to survive this, they needed to become as calculating and patient as their father. They needed to wait, to learn, to prepare. And when the time came, they needed to be willing to destroy everything. Bride with veil the illegal vows. On February 14, 1845, the quadruplets turned 18 years old. There was no celebration, no party, and no acknowledgement beyond a quiet family dinner. 2 weeks later, on March 1, the first marriage ceremony took place. Harrison had arranged everything in secret at a small church 20 miles from Magnolia Heights. The minister was a man named Reverend Thomas Carver, who had significant gambling debts that Harrison had agreed to pay in exchange for performing the illegal ceremonies and maintaining absolute silence about them. Evangeline wore a simple white dress. Solomon stood beside her in borrowed formal attire, looking both uncomfortable and furious. The ceremony lasted a mere 10 minutes. Reverend Carver spoke the traditional words. Evangeline and Solomon repeated the required vows, and the papers were signed. Harrison witnessed the event along with 2 men he had brought from Nashville, business associates who owed him favors. The entire event felt utterly surreal, a mockery of marriage performed under coercion in what should have been a sanctuary. 3 weeks later, Arabella's ceremony followed the exact same template. Then Cordelia's. Then, finally, Josephine's. By the end of April 1845, all 4 Beaumont quadruplets were legally married to Solomon Hayes in ceremonies that violated both Tennessee law and social custom, but were nonetheless meticulously documented in church records that Harrison ensured would remain hidden. The marriages, however, were not immediately consummated. Harrison insisted on a period of adjustment, time for everyone to accept their new roles before children were expected. This gave Solomon and the quadruplets precious months to solidify their alliance. They met secretly in the study hall Solomon had built years earlier. They spoke openly about their shared hatred for Harrison, the injustice of their situation, and possible futures. Solomon shared stories of his family, his mother and father he barely remembered, and Ruth who had taught him to read and write at immense personal risk. The quadruplets told him about their childhood as lab subjects, Harrison's constant measurements and testing, and the isolation and control that had defined their entire existence. They were not yet lovers or even friends in the conventional sense. They were co-conspirators, bound together by a shared captivity and a mutual determination to one day escape it. In June of 1845, Evangeline became pregnant. The announcement came during a family dinner where Harrison appeared more excited about the pregnancy than Evangeline herself. "This is excellent news," Harrison declared. "The first generation of the study is now underway. I will require documentation of every aspect, prenatal growth, birth weight, and milestones in their early childhood." He immediately took out a journal and began writing down observations. Evangeline sat silently, her hand resting on her stomach, her face devoid of any emotion. Over the subsequent months, Arabella, Cordelia, and Josephine also became pregnant. By January of 1846, all 4 sisters were expecting children due in the spring. Harrison was elated, viewing the pregnancies as successful experimental outcomes rather than the gestating lives of his own grandchildren. He ramped up his documentation, measuring the sisters weekly, logging their symptoms, and comparing their prenatal development in intricate charts. The quadruplets endured this with mounting bitterness. They had been reduced to breeding machines in Harrison's heredity study, valuable only for the data they provided. Solomon, witnessing this degradation, felt his hatred for Harrison intensify into something pure and absolute. This man had stripped every individual at Magnolia Heights of their humanity, reducing them to mere tools for his obsessive pursuit of scientific control. The enslaved population existed solely as labor. The quadruplets existed only as subjects. Solomon himself existed only as genetic material. Harrison Beaumont saw none of them as fully human. Baby a new generation of subjects. In April of 1846, Evangeline gave birth to a daughter she named Elizabeth, honoring her mother. 3 weeks later, Arabella had a son named Thomas. Cordelia delivered twin girls she called Sarah and Ruth. Josephine had a son she named Daniel. Within 6 weeks, Harrison had 5 new grandchildren. He was beside himself with fervor, meticulously measuring the infants, documenting every detail of their appearance and behavior. He kept comprehensive notes comparing the children, searching for patterns in how heredity from identical mothers, combined with the same father, might manifest. He ensured the children's names were registered in his plantation records as enslaved persons, guaranteeing they would remain his property regardless of any legal complexities arising from their parents' marriages. The next 3 years established a routine that became increasingly unbearable. The quadruplets raised their children while Harrison recorded every moment. Solomon continued his instructed carpentry work, all while secretly meeting with the sisters to strategize potential escape plans. The enslaved people at Magnolia Heights continued to suffer under harsh management, as Harrison showed no increased compassion. In 1847, 3 more children were born. In 1848, 2 more. By 1849, the study hall behind the main house had been converted into a nursery where 10 children lived under the care of their 4 mothers, all under Harrison's constant surveillance and recorded in his ever-expanding collection of journals. Hourglass not done, the tables turn. But Harrison's sheer obsession had, in some ways, made him careless. He was so completely focused on his heredity study that he failed to notice the organized resistance building up around him. Solomon had been quietly organizing for years, identifying enslaved people willing to take significant risks, gathering intelligence on Harrison's financial dealings, and learning about the broader network of associates who knew about the illegal marriages. The quadruplets had been meticulously documenting Harrison's every action, creating a detailed record of his study that could be used as evidence if they ever found authorities willing to intervene. Most crucially, they had discovered that Reverend Carver, the minister who had performed the ceremonies, had maintained his own set of records and was growing increasingly tormented by his role in Harrison's schemes. In September of 1849, all the preparations converged. A new circuit court judge named Samuel Morrison was appointed to Davidson County. Unlike previous judges who were often members of Harrison's social circle or financially indebted to him, Morrison was an outsider from East Tennessee with a reputation for actually upholding the law rather than bending it for wealthy planters. Solomon learned about Morrison through conversations with other enslaved people who carried news from Nashville. The quadruplets confirmed through their own sources that Morrison had already caused a stir by ruling against several prominent local families in inheritance disputes. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. Writing hand the letter. Evangeline drafted a carefully worded letter to Judge Morrison detailing the illegal marriages and the coercion surrounding them. She included specific dates, names of witnesses, locations of the ceremonies, and explained that documentation existed in church records. She also vaguely alluded to the broader heredity study, knowing the illegal marriages themselves were sufficient to launch a legal investigation. The letter was signed by all 4 sisters and by Solomon. Getting the letter to Morrison without Harrison discovering it required intricate planning. Solomon had established relationships with several free black laborers who periodically visited Magnolia Heights for various jobs. One of these men, a carpenter named Isaac, agreed to carry the letter to Nashville and deliver it directly to Judge Morrison's office. The danger was immense. If caught, everyone involved would face severe punishment. On September 28, 1849, Isaac successfully delivered the letter. Judge Morrison read it twice, his expression hardening. He immediately called in his clerk and dictated orders for a full investigation. On October 3, Morrison sent deputies to interview Reverend Carver. The minister, terrified of prosecution, immediately confessed everything. He provided copies of the marriage certificates and detailed testimony regarding Harrison Beaumont's coercion and threats. He explained he had performed 4 illegal marriages, knowing they were unlawful, because Harrison had paid off his gambling debts and threatened to destroy him if he refused. On October 7, Morrison issued a warrant for Harrison Beaumont's arrest. Deputies were dispatched to Magnolia Heights with instructions to take Harrison into custody and secure all documents related to the illegal marriages. Kitchen knife the final standoff. But Harrison had his own informants in Nashville. He received a warning on the morning of October 7 that Morrison was moving against him. He had perhaps 4 hours before the deputies would arrive at Magnolia Heights. Harrison quickly weighed his options. He could flee, but that meant sacrificing everything he had built. He could destroy evidence, but the marriage certificates were safely filed in church records beyond his reach. He could try to bribe or intimidate Morrison, but the judge's reputation suggested this would fail. Or, he could execute the very threat he had always made, eliminate everyone who could testify against him and claim complete ignorance of any illegal activities. Harrison called his 3 overseers to his study and gave them specific instructions. The quadruplets and their children were to be moved to a secure location, a locked cellar beneath the tobacco barn. Solomon was to be killed immediately and his body dumped in the Cumberland River. Any enslaved people likely to speak to the authorities were to be instantly secured or sold to distant plantations. The overseers departed to carry out these commands, but they had not accounted for the fact that Solomon and the quadruplets had been preparing for precisely this situation. Solomon had armed himself with tools that could be used as weapons. The quadruplets had gathered their children and retreated to the study hall, which they had secretly reinforced over the previous months with extra locks and barricades designed to delay any forced entry. When the overseers came for Solomon at his workshop, they found him ready. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Solomon was taller, stronger, and far more motivated than the 3 men who came to kill him. He fought with savage efficiency, using a heavy hammer to devastating effect. Within minutes, all 3 overseers were dead or disabled. Solomon did not waste a second. He ran toward the study hall, knowing the quadruplets and children were there, and knowing Harrison would come for them next. He reached the building to find it barred from the inside. He shouted to assure them it was him. Evangeline opened the door just enough for Solomon to slip through, then immediately resecured the bar. Inside, the 4 sisters and 10 children huddled together, terrified but resolute. "I have killed the overseers," Solomon said, breathing heavily. "There is no turning back now. We either fight or we die." Evangeline nodded. "Father will come for us. He cannot allow us to testify. Then we must ensure the testimony happens one way or another," Cordelia stated. She produced the journals she had been keeping, years of documented observations about Harrison's heredity study. "Even if we perish, these must reach Judge Morrison." Josephine added her own documents, sketches, and notes she had compiled. Arabella contributed letters Harrison had written to his associates discussing the study. Together, they had constructed a comprehensive record of Harrison's crimes. They heard shouting outside. Harrison had realized the overseers had failed. He was gathering other men from the plantation, enslaved people he forced to assist him at gunpoint. He surrounded the study hall and began attempting to force his way inside. Solomon and the quadruplets held the barricaded door while trying to keep the terrified children calm. Hours passed in an intense standoff. Harrison screamed threats from outside. He vowed to burn the building with everyone inside. He threatened to kill the children one by one. He swore he would make them all suffer for their betrayal, but he hesitated to follow through because destroying all the evidence and witnesses might still complicate matters with Judge Morrison. Balance scale aftermath and sentencing. The standoff concluded when deputies arrived from Nashville in the late afternoon. They found Harrison Beaumont standing outside a barricaded building, armed, surrounded by reluctant participants in the scene. When confronted by the deputies, Harrison attempted to explain that he was handling a slave rebellion, claiming dangerous criminals were barricaded inside and threatening his family. But his story was implausible. The deputies possessed Harrison's arrest warrant and testimony from Reverend Carver. They had enough information to know that something far more complicated than a simple rebellion was taking place. After tense negotiations, Solomon and the quadruplets agreed to emerge if Harrison was arrested first and if the deputies guaranteed their immediate protection. Morrison had instructed his deputies to handle this case with extraordinary caution, so they agreed. Harrison was arrested and placed in chains. Solomon emerged first, hands raised. Then the quadruplets came out with their children. The sight that met the deputies was bizarre, beyond anything they had anticipated. 4 identical women with 10 children, all claiming to be married to one enslaved man, all accusing one of Tennessee's most prominent planters of orchestrating illegal marriages as part of a heredity study. It was so strange that the deputies hardly knew how to proceed. Everyone was taken to Nashville. Harrison was jailed. Solomon was placed in protective custody, a highly unusual arrangement for an enslaved man. The quadruplets and their children were housed together in a guarded boarding house. Over the following weeks, Judge Morrison conducted an extraordinary investigation. He interviewed all parties. He reviewed the marriage certificates and Reverend Carver's testimony. He examined the journals and documents the quadruplets had compiled. He heard testimony from enslaved people at Magnolia Heights about the conditions there and Harrison's behavior. What emerged was a portrait of systematic exploitation and abuse justified by Harrison's perverse interpretation of hereditary science. Man judged the trial and legacy. The resulting legal case was unprecedented. Tennessee law offered no framework for prosecuting illegal marriages involving multiple wives and an enslaved groom. Technically, the marriages had never legally existed, so they could not be prosecuted as bigamy, but Harrison had coerced a minister into performing false ceremonies and had violated laws against miscegenation. He had also engaged in what Morrison termed systematic exploitation of persons under his legal authority for purposes both scientific and immoral. The trial began in December of 1849. It garnered enormous attention across Tennessee and beyond. Newspapers dispatched reporters. Legal scholars attended to observe the novel legal questions involved. The public gallery was packed daily with people eager to see 4 identical women testify against their own father. Evangeline testified first, describing their childhood as experimental subjects, the isolation Harrison enforced, and the constant measurements and documentation. She explained how Harrison had arranged the marriages, the coercion involved, and the years of being treated as breeding stock for his study. Arabella, Cordelia, and Josephine all provided similar testimony, each adding details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Solomon testified about being purchased specifically for this purpose, about Harrison's clinical description of the breeding program, and about the threats that kept everyone compliant for years. Reverend Carver testified about the ceremonies he had performed under duress. Harrison's defense was that he had acted in the best interests of advancing human knowledge, arguing that his heredity study would have contributed valuable data to the scientific understanding of inheritance and development. His attorneys argued that while his methods might seem unconventional, his intentions were progressive, aimed at improving plantation management through scientific breeding principles. This defense appalled the jury. The idea that Harrison had treated his own daughters and their children as livestock to be bred and studied was so repugnant that several jurors visibly recoiled during the closing arguments. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all charges. Judge Morrison sentenced Harrison to 20 years in prison, an extraordinarily harsh sentence for the era. World map a new beginning. But the case raised issues that extended far beyond Harrison's conviction. What would become of the quadruplets? Their marriages were legally void, meaning they held no legal standing as wives. Their children had been registered as enslaved persons, meaning they were technically Harrison's property and would be sold as part of liquidating his estate. Solomon remained enslaved, property of the Beaumont estate, and subject to sale. Without legal intervention, the victims of the heredity study would be scattered across the South, their families torn apart, and their suffering rendered meaningless. Judge Morrison took the extraordinary step of appointing himself guardian for the quadruplets and their children. He ruled that while the marriages were legally void, the circumstances of their creation and the systematic exploitation involved meant that simple property law could not adequately resolve the situation. He ordered that Solomon be sold to himself for $1, effectively freeing him. He placed the children under the quadruplets' custody with his own supervision, removing them from Harrison's property inventory, and he encouraged the quadruplets to leave Tennessee for northern states where they might find greater safety and freedom. The Beaumont quadruplets and Solomon Hayes departed Nashville in January of 1850. They traveled north together, eventually settling in separate communities in Ohio and Pennsylvania, where they could disappear into populations large enough to hide 4 identical women and one unusually tall black man who had been married to all of them. They maintained contact through letters but never lived together again. The sheer strain of everything they had endured made continuing as any kind of family impossible. Evangeline settled in Cleveland with her daughter Elizabeth and her son from a second marriage to a factory worker. Arabella relocated to Pittsburgh, where she used her musical training to teach piano lessons. Cordelia went to Philadelphia and worked as a governess. Josephine ended up in Cincinnati, where she opened a small shop selling her artwork. Solomon moved between these cities, never staying long anywhere, always restless, helping each woman as needed, but never finding peace himself. The children grew up aware of their unusual origins but striving to live normal lives. Some succeeded. Others struggled profoundly with the knowledge of how they had been conceived, of being the products of an experiment, of owing their existence to one man's monstrous desire for scientific control. Newspaper. The journals. The journals Harrison had meticulously kept were seized during the trial and sealed by court order. Judge Morrison ruled them too disturbing for public viewing, containing details that served no useful purpose beyond satisfying morbid curiosity. They remained sealed until 1923, when a researcher studying 19th-century plantation records obtained permission to examine them. What that researcher found confirmed everything testified to during Harrison's trial and revealed additional, disturbing details about the full extent of Harrison's experimentation. Harrison Beaumont died in prison in 1862 at the age of 77. He never admitted wrongdoing, maintaining until his death that his heredity study had been valuable scientific research disrupted by people too ignorant to understand its importance. No family members claimed his body. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. Magnolia Heights was sold by the state to satisfy Harrison's debts. The plantation passed through several owners before being divided into smaller parcels in the 1880s. Today, the land where the study hall stood is a shopping center. No historical marker acknowledges what happened there. The marriage certificates Harrison had filed remained in the church records where he had hidden them. When they were discovered in 1849 during Judge Morrison's investigation, they represented the only documentation that the marriages had ever occurred. The certificates were seized as evidence during Harrison's trial and subsequently stored in county archives. They remain there today, for identical documents bearing the signatures of 4 identical women, all married to the same man, all dated in the spring of 1845. All representing one of the strangest and darkest chapters in Tennessee history. Thinking Face. Final thoughts. The story of Solomon Hayes and the Beaumont quadruplets forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about exploitation, about the ways that supposedly scientific inquiry has been used to justify cruelty, and about how systems of power allow individuals to treat others as mere objects for study and experimentation. Harrison Beaumont was not unique in his belief that selective breeding could improve human populations. He was simply more systematic and more willing to use his own family as subjects. His heredity study represented a twisted version of ideas that were widespread in 19th-century America, ideas that would later evolve into eugenics movements that caused enormous suffering well into the 20th century. What is your take on this story? Do you believe everything was fully revealed, or might there be more information buried in those sealed journals that we still don't know? What became of the children born from Harrison's experiment? Did they ever find peace with their unusual origins? Leave your comment below and let me know what detail stands out most to you about this case. If you found the story compelling and want to hear more forgotten histories from America's darkest chapters, subscribe to Whispers and Frames and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates stories that challenge our understanding of family, science, and the terrible things people do in the name of progress. Remember, the past is never as distant as we would like to believe, and the patterns of exploitation we study in history often echo into our present in ways we fail to recognize until it is too late. See you in the next video.